Well, the second scripture reading this morning ties into this old phone, this wonderful, reliable equipment. The second reading comes from the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis, the first 9 verses. It is the call of Abram, who will become Abraham. And I apologize, I did not look up the page in the Pew Bibles, but it'll be near the front, which is where Genesis likes to live. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. May God's blessing rest upon the experiences of Scripture on this day. May it guide the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips. My grandmother's basement had a party line when I was a kid. And I can remember the phone ringing, and I'd go to answer it, and Grandma would holler from the kitchen upstairs, because Grandma was always in the kitchen, even though it was 105 outside and 105 inside. She was in the kitchen cooking away, and she'd holler at us, "Don't answer the phone." Sometimes we don't want to answer the phone because it's that dreaded call, the one that you're expecting in some ways but really hope not to get. It could be concerning a family member or a friend, or it could come with some sort of obligation that you committed to in a moment of weakness without fully understanding. Chairing a department, being president of a congregation, saying yes to God. Sometimes you just don't want to answer that phone when it rings. You want to, in our modern technology, swipe it to the other side, or just sit there and let it ring and ring and ring until finally the person gives up and goes away. That dreaded moment when God is reaching out to us and we really just don't want to answer. That dreaded call. Adam and Eve had that dreaded call in the garden story. After they had eaten the fruit, they were hiding in the bushes, and God's wandering around going, "Where are you at?" Cain had that dreaded call after he had lashed out in anger and killed his brother. And God is saying, "What have you done?" The people of Babel experienced that call. Noah experienced that dreaded call. Alexander Campbell wasn't even present at the convention when he was called to be the first president of what would become the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He was elected in absentia. And when he finally received the news, I wondered if he might have asked if he could just not answer. Well, Abram gets this call. And we don't know much about Abram before this point. The first section of Genesis is dealing with God and humans in a way where we have specific individuals named, but we're really not tracking a movement yet. In fact, in some circles and in some ways of understanding things, the Abram story is the beginning of the story of the people Israel. A lot of times you wouldn't even bother going back into the creation stories or into the flood story and things along those lines. You can start with Abram and understand all the way through the Gospels what Jesus is doing. Abram has received this call. Go from your place of being. I wonder if he was dreading answering the phone. To pick it up and receive that, it's time for you to move on, sort of call. I can remember going to graduation there at Hiram College, a wonderful disciples institution, in case you're thinking of schools. And going to graduation and just bawling my eyes out because I knew it was time to leave. That call had come. The same thing had happened at the end of seminary when I finished up there. I wasn't bawling my eyes out, but there was a great deal of grief because there was this acknowledgement that my time in that place had come to an end, and I had received a call to go somewhere else. Go from your place of being, Abram is told, your place of familiarity, where you've been working. The scripture makes reference to some things, people, that Abram had gathered. He was a very wealthy individual. He had quite the household. And in the ancient world, the household wasn't just your nuclear family or a couple generations. It was everything that was connected to you. And Abram, as the head of the household, had a lot of stuff connected to him. And yet he is told to go, and he does not take his whole family with him. He takes his spouse and his nephew and all of the servants and slaves and possessions, but he is leaving some family behind. He is leaving some friends behind. He had already moved once from Ur up to Haran, but now it is time to go. He has received the call. Pack your bags. And I wonder if in some ways it was like a lot of the orders we are used to receiving. It's pack your bags and then wait for a bit, and then now go, and then wait for a little bit longer, and then go some more, and oops, wait, we're changing the plans. Either which way, however it worked out, Abram was called. And in the story of Genesis, in the arc of this whole book, this is a turning point. This is why we spend time in Scripture, to understand how God is working and doing things. And this is a turning point in the Genesis saga. When it says in the beginning, we understand that this whole arc is a beginning process, and this is a turn. Because up until this point, the stories of God in Genesis, especially chapters 3 through 11, are stories of people mucking things up and God going through this 9-chapter-long period of attempted punishments and curses. I almost said churches. Curses and acts of mercy. God trying to bring people back around again. But this Abram moment is a change. Now, this is a story that would have been told around the campfires as the people are on the move. It's a story that would have been shared orally. It's a story that had they had phones, they would have called and said, "Did you hear about this?" before it's finally written down. But this turning point, when it happens, is a breaking in of God in a different sort of way. This God who can enter into eternal covenants, we have the rainbow, thanks be to God, calls Abram specifically. This isn't creation with Adam and Eve. This isn't Cain and Abel. This isn't the Babel story. This isn't even Noah, where Noah's called to a specific task. Build a boat, get the critters, grab the kids, that sort of thing. This is a different moment. And calls are funny sorts of things when we think about it. I mean, we can talk about the phone calls we get, the living memory of the party lines when you may or may not have listened in on other people's conversations. Kids do some interesting things sometimes. We can think of the technology we have today and the way we communicate back and forth. I'm not even certain the term call is used that often to communicate anymore. We say, text me, shoot me a message, or something along those lines. So calls are funny things when we think of communication, but calls also speak of vocation. Different sense of what it is to be called. It's not a literal picking up of the telephone or receiving of a text message. God friended me. I haven't seen the show yet. I have no idea if it's any good or not. But we speak of vocation as well. That strong feeling that we have or can have that we belong, at least for a period, in a certain field or career or mission or ministry or something along those lines. To be called, in this sense, is to be set aside. God comes to Abram and calls. You are being set aside for a purpose, a task, a mission, a ministry. And often that call that is connected to vocation is to also realize that when it comes to us working with God, we are in over our heads. And yet we respond to the call. Because it is God who has reached out, and it is God who is empowering us. It is God who calls Abram to up and leave and go to this strange land with a strange people and to trust that he will be able to make a life there. To leave the cities there in Ur and Haran, the great sort of center point of civilization in that period, and to move to the countryside and to trust. God reached out to Abram. God called. But one of the troubling things in this turning point, when God calls us, it's not because Abram is anyone special. Not that we're aware of. I mean, we can look back and say, oh, he was special. We're all special in that way. But Abram has not done anything to date that we know about. There's nothing in Scripture that talks about Abram being an especially righteous person, that he had done these wonderful things, that he had focused on God. Now, the traditions that have come out of Scripture, looking back, we have tried to make Abram look like he was a lot more special. Sometimes we call him the first monotheist. He was one of the first ones to worship God, rejecting his parents' religious traditions and things along those lines. But Scripture doesn't tell us that. All it tells us is God reached out. God called. We're not sure what kind of prep Abram had. We don't even know if Abram went to Sunday school. We don't even know if he received a set of Scripture from a stranger on the street, or if he even cracked it open, if there was such a thing to crack open. We don't know if there was a clergy person or an in-law that pulled him aside and said, you know, Abram, I believe God has great things in store for you. You should be listening to hear what God is saying. We don't have any of that. What we have is God calls. And God's calling for this vocation moment, well, it's an intention of blessing. Abram, you need to go, and through you, all of creation will be blessed. Up until this point, chapters 3 through 11, it's God looking at the earth and saying, boy, people are really messing things up. Now I've got to go ahead and correct it. I've got to make some sort of change. I've got to try to bring people back. That's the understanding, the experience of Scripture. This Scripture is a different sort of experience of God. God says, you know what? I want you to go out and be a blessing. Through you, I, God, am going to do great things. Abram is going to be the root for a movement for wholeness. 9 chapters of people mucking it up, and corrective punishments, or attempted ones at least, are giving way in this story to a call of unmerited and pure grace. God called Abram. And we are invited to pay attention to the order of things in this text, because Abram did not work for this. It wasn't God saying, this is going to be yours, but now you have to go out and work for it. If you go and do these things, check these boxes, say these words in this order, then you will receive this blessing. It's not there in the text. Abram is not of special stock in the sense that he is royalty or something along those lines. He is a human being, a seemingly, but not actually, random human being that God called. And Abram answered. The dreaded call came, and he answered. To God's glory, and despite Abram's and Sarai's efforts, God was able to keep those promises. Because if we continue to read the story, we find all sorts of moments where Abram does his best to muck things up. And yet God works to keep the promises. But this is one person in the whole story. So how much good can a single person pull off? How much good can one family or one congregation of faith pull off? Well, the promise is that God will bless the earth through Abram. God calls Abram. Abram becomes Abraham. Abraham and Sarah's great-grandson is going to be the one who feeds Egypt and the nations around Egypt. And among those nations that are around Egypt is the nation that will be called the people Israel. And the people Israel are challenged and called to be a witness to the nations. And from that line comes the one that we recognize as the Christ, the anointed Messiah of the living God, a blessing to the nations. God works to fulfill the promises of the call. Abram was set aside for a vocation. God called Abram. God has called us. We each have received that message. And like some that I have met, we may be fighting it tooth and nail. There's a great cartoon, a comic, the footprints, the little wonderful poem of faith. Why is there only one set of footprints? Well, there's a little comic that Jesus is standing there with arm around someone. So this, that's where we walked side by side. And that one set of prints is where I carried you. And those parallel lines is where I drug you kicking and screaming. God has called us. We have each been given some sort of mission and ministry, whether we are fully aware of it, whether it is fully formed. We don't know until we are in that place and we respond to it, that blessed call. It's something that we can talk about, possibly even phoning a friend and telling them about what it is that God is doing in our lives. Because I believe that in the case of this church, God is once again on this day telling us to go. To take with us the things that are of value to the vocation that we are called to. And to go. Whether it is literally going out from these walls into the world, or whether it is going forth in faith to be something that God is envisioning, I don't know. But I believe we are called. We are called to be church today. Thanks be to God. Amen.